What makes you happy?
Be yourself, be positive. Just another mindset.
Hello, friends, and welcome to a new episode of the Just Another Mindset podcast. We need a paradigm shift if it comes to our economic and social systems. Let us drive this change together. The Just Another Mindset podcast shares inspiration and tangible techniques on how to create seismic shifts in an outdated system, collectively and for individuals alike. My name is Ismael, and each week I bring to you a relevant conversation, message, or theme that will not only entertain you, but help you to change towards a more meaningful and satisfying life. Get encouraged by listening to successful thought leaders, inspiring individuals, and impressive changemakers. Change from within will last and create positive results for all of us. Let us get inspired and embrace collective changes for the better. Vincent Obisie Orlu is a natural resource governance researcher at Good Governance Africa. His research focuses on ESG risks, natural resource governance of critical minerals, oil and gas, the energy transition, and advancing Africa's sustainable development. In this episode, we talk about a just energy transition in Africa. You will learn about social responsibility and ethical governance. Before we dive deep into the current state of the energy transition in Africa, you will learn about COP28, doing business in Africa, holding companies accountable, and what each citizen can do in order to make a change. Vincent shares his expert view on a sustainable energy mix, and you will learn about the great and oftentimes forgotten role of critical minerals. And with that, Vincent, a warm welcome to the Just Another Mindset podcast. And my first question for you is, how do you feel and what is on your mind?
Thank you for inviting me, Ismael. How do I feel? Well, excited. I'm looking forward to our conversation today. What's on my mind? One, the fact that COP28 is coming up soon. It's going to be held in the UAE this year, I think, and there's going to be a lot of discussions about how we go forward from some of the developments and progress that happened at COP27, as well as really just looking at the question of energy security globally and how the war in Ukraine has really changed countries' view and perspectives around energy security.
And we're going to talk about COP quite a bit. We're going to talk about energy. And Vincent, maybe it does make sense for our audience to give a little bit of a context. Just now in our pre-chat, we talked about a big multicultural wedding of your sisters. Once more, all the best for her and everybody. And you shared with me that you are born in Nigeria, you partially grew up in the US, and you have been living in South Africa for 20 years. And maybe you're going to briefly talk us through important components of your life that you feel make sense to share here with our audience and to create a context.
Not a problem. So I'm the oldest of five kids. My parents have myself and my four younger sisters. So I'm the only boy in the family. And so I was born in Nigeria. We moved, myself, my mom, my younger sister moved to the US to join my dad, who was doing his PhD at the time. We moved over, stayed there for a bit. During that time, the family was blessed with my youngest three siblings being born in the States. And from there, 2002, we moved over to South Africa. And South Africa's been home for me ever since. And South Africa's really been the one place that I truly feel and understand is home. So having that said, it creates this third culture kid esque experience where home is a bit more complicated. You have an accent like mine where it doesn't really fit in anywhere. You have the understanding of what the local context is, but you don't necessarily always feel like you fit in. So it's beautiful, it's outrageous, it has its days.
No, No, it must be. Thank you very much for sharing that, Vincent. And having lived for 20 years in South Africa, I have not been myself, but I hear amazing things about nature and the environment, and maybe we can use that. Have you always been excited and interested in the environment and in nature, or when did you develop a passion for that?
I think I've always been fascinated by how the world works. In many ways, the understanding of the different things that make the world work and make us exist as how we are today has always been something that I've been interested in. But my passion for nature and the environment, or rather my understanding of it, really started with me coming into with the pandemic. So the pandemic really highlights a lot of the ways in which we are intrinsically linked to society and the ecosystems that we have around us, seeing the ways in which the lack of human activity caused the bounce back of certain populations of animals was just fascinating to me. And this is not to say that prior to that I was not interested or fascinated by the environment, but that was really the moment in which it was like, oh wow, this is really something new. This is really a different way to look at it. And from there, I was finishing up my studies. I've always been engaged in, at some level, in issues around environmental justice. Um, During my undergrad, I was part of this collective that looked at climate action and food security and food sustainability on my campus. But it wasn't until me becoming more of an adult in the last 3, 4 years that I've really come to understand a bit better what the environment means for not just myself, but and how I impact it, but also for the world in general and how we impact and what our impacts implications are at a broader level.
Vincent, talking about justice and understanding how the world works, what does social responsibility mean to you?
So social responsibility is often one of these buzzwords that gets thrown around here and there. But social responsibility really means taking ownership of the externalities that you bring into the world. So for a company, it might mean supporting the communities in which you exist and you operate, be it through favorable and effective and equitable labor practices, or ensuring that the people who are in the area have access to the resources, basic resources, to ensure a good quality of life and standard of living for them. For individuals, it might mean paying those who work for you a fair wage. Not littering, not causing or creating significant negative externalities on the environment, um, managing your share of water usage effectively, not just overusing water to a point where you have, but your neighbor won't have it all. Because in many ways, humans are very interconnected. If one person has and other people don't, creates this problem. I'm sure many people have seen that experiment with the monkeys and the grapes, where one monkey is getting all the grapes, and the other monkeys see the unfairness of this and they get angry and they start to throw a tantrum. And what we don't want within our societies is situations where the inequality in the world that exists around us has caused people to throw tantrums and just engage in chaotic and problematic behaviors that's not sustainable.
Hmm. Absolutely. And I think we have reached certain levels of inequality, and that is true for probably, if not all countries in the world, but for sure for most of them. And then also, if we go cross country and cross continent, we have a lot of inequality, Vincent. And if we talk about social responsibility, what does ethical governance define for you or mean to you?
So I think we can divide ethical governance into a few different spaces. When I look at ethical governance, I'm not just looking at ethical governance in the sense of corporate governance, right? I'm also looking at this ethical governance in the sense of governance from the perspective of the government and governing parties and how the political bodies and political organs of a state work and function. And I think the two, your corporate governance and your governance in the sense of how the state works and operates, are very interconnected. Because, as we've seen in South Africa, if there is corruption within the state, it creates a situation context where rules of corporate governance can be flouted um, without much consequence in the interim period. So when I look at ethical governance, I'm looking first at, are the rules of government behavior, of political participants' behavior, clear and set in stone? What are the norms by which people are to be held by and held accountable by? One, two, how are the processes to exist? How are they to be engaged with? Three, are there is there equity in these processes? Um, is there only a vocal minority which takes over everything, or are there rules and processes, due diligence processes within the formation of policy, within the formation and approach to outcomes? Then, when I'm looking at corporate governance, I'm looking at, how do companies engage with the communities? Do you do your due diligence on the projects that you're to be operating on? What does your board compensation look like? Are you just there to maximize shareholder value without any respect for the externalities that you might produce? Or are you there to maximize shareholder value, but also consider the fact that communities and other people around you exist? How do you abide by the rules of the land that you operate in? And I know this gets us into a conversation of home versus host country jurisdictions, but I think slowly we're seeing the world moving towards a bit of a more standardized approach across different jurisdictions to ensure that companies do not default and just go around the corner and say, because there are no effective policies in this country, I'm going to go to country ABC and just cause problems to benefit my shareholders. So these are all different issues that we need to consider when looking and considering and understanding ethical governance, that goes beyond just the shareholder value in the company, but also goes into the country and how the country operates.
I fully agree to that. And you've basically talked about corporations and you talked about governance. So if we talk about ethical governance, where do you see the individual and maybe also the power of the individual to influence either way companies or governments?
I think the individual has a big role to play in both governments and with influencing companies. Individuals can influence companies by how they vote with their dollars, to use a cliche term. If individuals say tomorrow that we are no longer going to buy fossil fuel emitting cars, companies have to, make do and move towards producing hybrids and electric vehicles. So, in that respect, individuals have significant market power to move and push companies a certain way. I think we're seeing that very clearly with some of the ESG stuff. Um, Individuals have pushed for a more sustainable form to capitalism, and whether ESG is doing everything that it says it would do in its current existence, in its current form, is a question we can debate on and have a conversation about later on. But individuals have been a major driving force towards this more less shareholder centric version and view and perspective of capitalism, and more towards a more stakeholder engagement form and view of capitalism. With regards to governments, individuals have the power to protest in democratic regimes as well as autocratic regimes. Individuals can protest and say, we object to these rules and norms and ways in which things are going. Individuals can also vote and show their positions with votes, as well as, just call for assemblies in countries where there are smaller localized groups of individuals. Individuals can be actively participating in their local communities by saying, this is what we need to do, or having informing little groups and movements to do something like that. I think individuals also have another role in which they can play, such as yourself, in which you are informing the media, you're speaking to other people, you are having discussions about what you think is important, and you're informing the zeitgeist, if you will, of the collective.
No, definitely. I have a couple of follow up questions. A really brief one is, what is ESG and what does it stand for?
ESG is environmental social governance, and it's a way in which companies will look at how they operate that is supposed to go beyond just the bottom line of shareholder value. Is to take environmental, social, and governance considerations. Environmental considerations being how waste management processes, carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, water usage, natural resource usage. Social considerations include wage wages for your laborers, how companies engage with communities and social license to operate, as well as fair cooperation, fair engagements, social fair engagements with within the extractive industries. You're looking for fair engagement with the uh, areas in which people exist and people perform. Um, Governance includes your corporate governance, but also, I believe, goes a bit further into discussions around the ethical adherence to the rules. Which rules are you abiding by? Are you looking to abide exclusively by home rule jurisdiction, which is the jurisdiction in which you are incorporated? Or are you also looking to abide by your host rules and your host nation jurisdiction?
Thank you very much for that clarification. And we're going to shine a bit more light on ESG in a moment from now. But I had a different follow up question as well when you talked about ethical governance. And you already mentioned one major, let's call it challenge or hurdle, which you said could be corruption. So maybe we can talk a little bit about challenges that hinder governments or countries or even whole continents to enforce more ethical governance. Maybe that's question number one. And then maybe we can shift from there and talk a little bit about best practices or examples that you would like to also highlight where we see a shift towards more ethical governance. But maybe we start with particular challenges and then we can shine light on some best practices, if you may.
I think challenges that exist for ethical governance include, if we look at this from an economic perspective, if the cost of engaging in bad behavior is very low, individuals will be more likely to engage in bad behavior. So, um, ethical governance includes issues around anti corruption regimes, issues around norms, your King Code. I think I'm jumping between the 2 points, but I think your King Code is one of your best ways to really enforce ethical governance within companies and corporations, and address questions of how should board members and your board operate. What are the priorities that they should have, and how should they how can they prevent these problems and challenges that exist within the environment? How can the costs of bad behavior and maladaptive behavior be increased to such a form that individuals will not dare to go and abide and engage in them without significant sanction or threats of sanction, risk of sanction. Um, we see a lot of companies engage in poor ethical governance. We recently, not too long, last year, sorry, we saw this with Glencore as a lot of information was brought out on the last 20 or so years on how Glencore had operated in different African jurisdictions. And I think the point I was making earlier about home rule versus host rule comes into effect very, very clearly here because for big multinationals, they get to pick and choose where they operate. Um, and in general, the rules do not exist, or the enforcement mechanisms for the rules do not exist effectively across different regions. I can tell you that the rules that exist in Germany around corruption and anti corruption are not the same ones that exist in somewhere like the DRC. So a German company can go and operate in the DRC while engaged in corrupt and problematic behavior that would definitely have them fined and facing significant legal sanction in Germany, but they can continue with that with impunity in somewhere like the DRC. So it's that bridging of those two gaps uh, to make sure that companies perform and exist in a way that they aren't just bringing benefit to their shareholders, but they're also creating some public general utility overall at the end of the day.
To which regard do we need somewhat of a global approach solution, and where do we stand on that? If you have any insights, that would be interesting to hear.
I think with regards to a global solution, I think one of the first things that is being done is the move towards a global minimum tax for all companies. I think stuff like the Panama and Paradise Papers really exposed this challenge and this problem of how different individuals and wealthier individuals use the existence of differential tax regimes to avoid and sometimes dodge taxes or reduce their tax liability in countries. So that's one. But I also think that systems and institutions such as the Canadian Ombudsman for Responsible Enterprise, the CORE, um, the ombudsperson, Sherry, has been doing some really great work in looking at the ways in which different companies that are different Canadian companies can be held, regardless of where they're in operation, to the standard of Canada. So by doing that, you prevent this, or you do something to address this gap that exists between the spirits of the law in the home country versus the letter of the law and how it's limited to reach them when it comes to the countries in which they operate. But I also think that we need to consider the fact that a lot of these moves and movements are very much voluntary. If the company says no to it, you know, there's very little that can be done. So I think at some level, it is also the role of individuals to come in and say, this is what we need companies to do. Say, this is how we would like to see you as a company operating. Um, Lastly, I think the recent, perhaps not so recent, um, situation with Total in Uganda also presents some ESG questions and questions and challenges around how companies can be held accountable for the harm they might cause in be it in the environment or also on the livelihoods of individuals.
Talking of which, I don't know if you have any insights on that, but if we look at a certain time frame of 10 years, maybe of 20 years, how has doing business in Africa changed for multinational corporations? And by doing business, I also explicitly want to say exploiting and using arbitrage that is against the planet, the social realms, and yeah, this whole ethical governance. Is there anything that you can share with us?
I think that to some degree, the way in which Africa has existed within business frameworks has largely remained the same as a place for the extraction of raw materials, but has also changed in many ways. Africa is now a vibrant, bustling market. You have innovations such as M-Pesa in Kenya, which has revolutionized the way in which banking is done there. A friend of mine was recently in Kenya, and she was telling me how in Kenya they don't use cash and they rarely use credit cards. And so, doing business in Africa has changed, but has also remained the same in some ways. Um, yes, there is still some arbitrage that exists and occurs, but at the same time, over policies and ways in which companies operate on the continent has changed significantly. You have a lot more focus on social licenses to operate in countries such as Ghana and South Africa. Mining companies cannot simply come in and just be complete extractors. They now understand that they need to get the population, the local population, on board with them in order for them to operate. Otherwise, they know that they're going to face significant challenges without them. Companies that are involved in food and transportation also aware that Africa has a vibrant population of young farmers who are eager to get into the industry. So there are also opportunities to use and make use of young people as both a market, but also and consumers, but also as producers for different sources. And I think that in the next 20 years, everything being equal, we might see a further shift and change in the way Africa exists within the business community and how doing business in Africa exists, from just a consumer of things to hopefully a producer of many resources and goods beyond just raw materials. We're talking about manufactured goods, manufacturing, and onshoring of these different technologies. And I think that as the world is looking to diversify supply chains, we're seeing the beginnings of this happen. However, none of this can happen and continue unless the issue of access to energy on the continent is effectively addressed.
And you raise a very important fact here, and that is the access to energy. And Vincent, you are very passionate, and you also hold a postgraduate diploma in energy policy and energy transition, if I'm not mistaken. And maybe we can talk about the role of energy if it comes to a more just transition in Africa and maybe even globally. What are your thoughts on that?
I think so. Firstly, I'm currently pursuing a postgraduate diploma in energy leadership at the University of Witwatersrand Business School, and it's a great honor to be a part of the cohort of 2023. In all of the glory and challenges that exist with the program, that exist with being a student again. It's fascinating. But in terms of the energy transition, how it exists for Africa, I think we need to divide looking and considering the energy transition to two stages. Firstly, Africa is a continent that is struggling till today with the issue of energy access. And oftentimes, when we speak about the energy transition, we're looking and considering or imagining the exact route by which European countries took to transition to renewables. A country like Germany, which has been making significant use of renewables, did not go over a very short period of time from fossil fuels to renewables. There was the stopover at nuclear at some point in time, for however long that was. There was also the stopping over at gas to support the move away from coal towards a more renewable, low carbon future. And I think on the continent, we really need to consider how the energy transition will operate. Renewable energies are great. However, they have one big challenge for the continent. They're variable in their supply. If the sun is not shining at maximum brightness, the amount of energy you'll be producing or receiving to the grid is limited. So, in a context where you have energy access issues, it's not the best solution to just say, okay, guys, we need to transition and increase your buildup of solar PV and wind, because again, you have different, sectors, different parts of Africa can work best with different forms of renewable energy. South Africa is blessed to be able to have both wind and solar potential, but in a country like Algeria, you only really have solar potential, right? What are you going to do? Are you going to now say to Algeria, you need to now add wind potential, wind energy, where it's not going to be profitable? So these are questions that need to be asked. Additionally, the question of storage comes in, and storage is often the most expensive components when it comes to renewable energy systems. Um, the lack of technology sharing or technology access on the African continent to these renewable energy technologies and new storage technologies presents a further impediment for the transition. So I think when looking at the transition in Africa, it is critical to understand that Africa needs an effective energy mix that enables it to not only decarbonize, but also, meet baseload energy needs. Without an energy mix that meets baseload energy needs, the continent is not going to have the bright future that we hope it will.
Another follow-up question I have is, how does the electric grid in Africa look, and how well do you exchange energy among different nations? You mentioned Algeria and you mentioned South Africa. Would those two be connected in a certain way, or how does energy flow via the continent?
So there are regional power pools in which countries within the region form a power pool. However, as it stands today, there are various regional power pools. You have the Southern African power pool, you have the West African power pool, you have the North African power pool, which is also connected in some way to the European power pool as well as the Middle East power pool, um, because Algeria sometimes buys power from European countries and vice versa. So you have regions which are connected within their power pools. However, more needs to be done to make these power pools a more significant actor in the electrification of the continent, where countries can buy and sell power between themselves. In terms of what the grid on the continent looks like today, the grid is still developing. We do not have as developed a grid as somewhere like Germany, even South Africa, which is arguably one of the more developed African countries in terms of grid capacity, has areas which have limited electricity access. So, it's important to consider this. Additionally, the way in which our populations exist are quite dispersed. So there's some places which will be very expensive for grid to reach and grid to come to and connect to, as well as areas which are very easy to connect to the grid.
Do you have any information? I know it's a very detailed question, but how companies would be incentivized to actually create a grid also in very remote areas? And maybe you can give an example for one particular country. Probably this otherwise wouldn't hold for whole Africa, but maybe you have an idea or thought on that.
I think that with companies being incentivized, this is where the issue of decentralized grids comes into effect and comes into play. Decentralized grids present a huge opportunity for the electrification of rural communities and rural areas which are off the beaten path. And I think this is one of the big areas and big places in which renewable energy can really help and support the continent's energy transition as well as benefiting several people and many people. So you'll have a company come in, develop low grid capacity distribution systems, and now sell power to this rural community. I know in Kenya there's something that's done through the M-Pesa network, and I know that there are efforts being made in South Africa for independent power producers to support local communities in terms of electricity access through distributed and delocalized grid connection. But it's also something that government needs to work on, especially in South Africa, to incentivize and create policies around which make this more favorable for not only companies but also communities to really jump on board and get on board to make sure it's possible and doable.
Vincent, how could an effective energy mix look like? And maybe we stick with the example of South Africa, if this is the country that you're most familiar with.
So South Africa is the country I'm most familiar with. A lot of my work, when I'm looking at energy, looks at South Africa's energy mix in that question. I think an effective energy mix for South Africa would include a significant reduction in the level of coal power, an increase in the level of gas, um, a larger share of renewables in the form of solar and wind, a larger share of hydro, while being cognizant of the fact that hydroelectricity comes with the risk of climate change to the levels of water in the dams. And hydroelectricity can sometimes be this trade off between access to energy and access to water. And that needs to be very closely monitored. So, an increase in the share of renewables in the form of wind and solar, an increase in the share of nuclear, because while nuclear might be a bit of a dirty word in Germany, nuclear is still is actually the only low carbon um, baseload form of power that we have in some parts of the continent that does not necessarily have the climate impacts or climate um, vulnerabilities that you say a hydroelectric has.
I think that could be a discussion for a couple of hours by itself, talking about nuclear power. And as you said, there are very different opinions and also experiences in Germany and France and the UK, in different countries within the European Union. And then if we look that up on a global scale, then it becomes even more complex. So maybe we don't go down the nuclear path. But I would be very interested if we talk about this effective energy mix. To which extent is South Africa, or should South Africa integrate policy or write policy in order to create, this effective energy mix and a different way of creating energy for the country?
So we have a paper called the IRP, the Integrated Resource Plan, which looks at what an effective energy mix for 2050 would look like in South Africa. So policies do exist. I think where the bigger challenge is getting there is in getting there. So and I think this is a big challenge with South Africa. We have fantastic policies on paper. When it comes to implementation of these policies, we tend to have some challenges in terms of getting there and reaching our end goal or end destination. So the RRP really states out what an effective future energy mix would look like with different values and different amounts by 2050. It has not, however, been updated since 2019. So there's a lot of calls for it to be updated and looked into and revised. Um, we have a fantastic policy called the Independent Renewable Energy the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Plan, um, which looks at bringing in private sector actors to bid for parts of the grid where they will now build up renewable energy generation capacity. They'll now feed into the national grid to support the move away from coal. So in South Africa, these policies and these plans exist. Perhaps they're not moving fast enough, and more needs to be done to just support the transition here.
No, thank you very much. I think that gives a very clear picture about the energy mix and how an effective one could look like in South Africa. And Vincent, I would like to circle back a little bit and talk about ESGs. And in an article that you wrote in 2023, which is called Is ESG Just Colonialism 2.0? I would like to read a quote and then I have a question. And it reads the following. In a recent editorial for the Washington Examiner, African Energy Chamber Executive Chair NJ Ayuk labeled environmental social governance, ESG, as colonialism 2.0. Mr. Ayuk argues that ESG criteria for financial investments are being weaponized to impose green energy on Africa at a moment when the continent needs to make use of its fossil fuels for the development of its economies. And I would love, especially in the context of that we've just created, hear you elaborating a little bit on that statement and what your thoughts are.
So now, Mr. Ayuk wrote an article in which he said and stated that the environmental concerns and considerations around ESG create impediments for energy access on the continent. And so while I agree that the focus and fixation on the environmental aspect of ESG is problematic, there's a lot more to ESG than that. I don't believe that ESG is colonialism 2.0 by any stretch of the imagination. I think that um, while there's a lot of push to reduce investments in fossil fuel generation around the world and globally, I also think that African countries should be considered as a bit of an exception to the rule for the time being. in terms of ensuring their access to energy and electrification, while also creating incentives to make sure that on the continent, renewables maintain their competitiveness to be and form a larger part of the energy mix. I don't think that we'll see for the longest time a day when renewable energy generation will form a large capacity of baseload. Um, in the immediate period, renewable energy is still going to be very much focused on variable energy generation. But over the longer run, I think we'll get there. In the article, I also highlight that a lot of the criticisms about ESG are quite valid. There's a lack of systematic approach across rating systems, greenwashing and social washing, companies saying that they are green in their actions when they're actually just really not. They're just showing green credentials or virtue signaling without any actual substance is very common. We saw a situation where Deutsche Bank was was raided by the police not too long ago. I think either earlier this year or last year to investigate them for their greenwashing. So without effective and genuine commitment to ESG criteria and ESG commitments, we're going to have a continued problem where people will see this as colonialism 2.0 when looking and bring it to a continent where it really wasn't made for the African continent ESG. Um, in many ways, the needs and the issues and challenges faced by the continent are an afterthought. Not really the thing that people wake up and stay awake at night when thinking of what are the ESG considerations of a company operating in Africa or an investment in African energy. What are the ESG considerations for energy access? At times, you'll see um, with ESG that two social goods will cross and interfere with each other. Is it more socially beneficial for you to have energy access, or is it more socially beneficial for this community to have a clean, um, great, carbon emission reductions? I think that we're getting to a point where we'll be able to walk and chew gum and do both. But when these two conflicts come into contest, when these two issues come into conflict, it will be very common that people say and point to and say, this is colonialism. You're trying to enforce your will on us, as opposed to understanding our context and working with us to find ways to address it.
To which extent do you feel or see that this co-creation, let's just call it, is in fact happening? As you said, it's not company or corporation A coming into a country in Africa and telling what and how it should be done. And on the other hand, maybe there needs to be some financial, some capital coming from within Africa or even from the global side. But to which extent do we understand that it's a mutual agreement moving forward? If you would have any thoughts on that, I would be very interested.
I think we haven't gotten there yet. We're in the process of getting there, and I really hope that the pace increases a bit faster. As it stands today, ESG is still very much something there in the West. Um, yes, sure, you have chief financial officers and chief sustainability officers on the continent for big companies in places like South Africa. They're aware of these issues. But in somewhere like Nigeria, a company might be aware that ESG is a thing, but they don't necessarily know what that means or how that impacts them directly or effectively. So it's going to be important to get more African voices into the room in discussing these issues and discussing ESG and discussing the environment and discussing social considerations around the environment, discussing what good governance of the of resources looks like for people. It's going to require more engagement, stakeholder engagement, as opposed to just being a conversation that we have in Brussels or Paris or the financial capitals of the world.
How do we get more African voices in the room or on the table, depending on where we have our discussions?
Speak to them. I know it sounds very informal, but speak to them. Actually spend time engaging with not just African businesses, but also African policymakers. Have chats with them about what their legal frameworks look like and how we can incorporate certain issues and questions around the transition, the just transition and ESG into them. Um, I was in Saudi Arabia for the Future Minerals Forum earlier this year, and something that stayed with me was a conversation in which South Africa's Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy, Gwede Matashe, was speaking, and um, Peter Leon said, I think it was either Peter Leon or one of his associates, was speaking about how in South Africa, for the longest time, we've had ESG within our mining frameworks. However, we didn't necessarily have and call it by that name. Um, and so, in some ways, African countries have these considerations that are associated and related to ESG within their legal frameworks, but they don't necessarily call it ESG. So, having these conversations with Africans will be able to make those direct linkages to say, so this is what you're meaning when you say this, and remove these perceptions about it being colonialism 2.0 and this force of nature being imposed on Africans to just prevent them from having good lives.
You just mentioned a conference in Saudi Arabia, and what could be other platforms for those conversations to take place? Is it COP? Has it been COP27? Could it be COP28? Do you see that this is a big lever, or where do those conversations take place, or would you like to see more of them taking place?
I think we often see a lot of these conversations taking place domestically, but within the country, having chats about what this means, and maybe at an event like the mine investment in Daba in South Africa, we have this conversation. At an event like Africa Energy Week in South Africa, we have this conversation as well. At events such as the Future Minerals Forum in Saudi Arabia, we have these conversations. But I think I'd like to see a lot more of these conversations occurring outside of places like that. And as great an opportunity as COPs are to have these discussions, if we only have those discussions at COP, it's a problem. When people go home, you're not thinking about that anymore. As soon as I leave the vicinity of COP, everything that was discussed might have left my mind. You know, what does that mean for people who are going to still be dealing with these issues day after? So, if we can have these conversations at those different places, but also bring them home and have these in our local context, it creates huge opportunities for value creation and discussion and debate around how do we do this, how do we approach this. If we can also have situations where foundations such as German foundations, your CAS, your GIZs, um, the French foundations sit down and engage and have conferences with African thought leaders and African policymakers and activists on the continent about what this means and how we're going to approach and deal with these issues. That also really helps to feed into improving things.
And then also incorporate the output of those conversations, right? Not only having the conversations and then the big corporations still go for whatever somebody has suggested or they have figured out for themselves. But yes, have those conversations, but then also take them serious and incorporate the outcome, because otherwise it will also become a little bit frustrating for Vincent to have 20 conversations, but everything that he says is not being incorporated, and he may stop talking to Ismael. I don't know if you have any thoughts or insights on that.
Oh no, definitely. I think we definitely see some of that happening on the continent at times where it feels like we just talk and talk and talk, and the progress is very slow, or there is no progress whatsoever on some of these issues. I mean, we'd been talking about the loss and damages fund for how many years? And it's only last year that the start of the process towards developing a loss and damages fund occurred. So it's fascinating to see how slowly things move. And yeah, it feeds into the frustration people might have. But at the same time, I would encourage anyone engaged in these processes to not give up hope. Um, Sometimes it's gonna take you knocking on the same door time after time after time after time and losing your voice time after time before even the slightest needle is moved. So yeah.
No, absolutely. And maybe we can use that hope and take a look again at COP, and COP28 is coming. And maybe you can share with us what kind of hopes or desires you have for this very broad international exchange of ideas, but also, yeah, more tangible action plans, if any.
Ooh, that's a loaded one. I think I'm hoping to see a bit of action on a global carbon tax or global carbon tax initiative. Um, as well as some deeper discussions on what CBAM means for the developing world. CBAM is the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism, and there's a lot of fear and concerns in Africa that CBAM is going to really just eviscerate us here, in part due to the fact that a lot of our energy generation is still fossil fuel based, and the transition to renewable energy and renewable energy sources will not be an overnight process. It'll be a gradual one in many ways for the continent. It's worth noting that the African continent makes up about 5% of global emissions. However, we're now expected to quickly move and decarbonize as quickly as possible. And I don't think that's either fair, equitable, or just. So I worry, along with others, that CBAM could create some significant issues and hurdles for the continent. So I'd like to see some discussions around that. I'd like to see more progress done on the loss and damages fund that was opened up and developed at COP. I'd like to see more done with regards to the just energy transition partnership programs. What does that look like, and how are we expanding these things to make sure that not only do we help African countries develop these renewable energy power generation alternatives, but how do we make sure that those who are negatively impacted by the transition still have some stake in the positive benefits of the transition? In South Africa today, we have a lot of mining affected communities or communities that will be negatively affected by the energy transition, your coal mine communities, up in arms about it, saying that this transition will not be just. So, how do we ensure that the transition is in fact and indeed just? Is another one I'd like to see. I'd also like to see conversations around what energy security means for the world. The recent war in Ukraine has really showed us that energy security becomes everything at the end of the day. Um, there's a lot of fear from some countries to be involved and around how they would support Ukraine because of their dependence on energy, natural gas access, and natural gas from Russia. Um, so how has that, as well as seeing countries now looking to create and develop new agreements, this will definitely have impacts on, the transition timeframes for countries like Germany, countries like um, France, and others. What does that mean for them? How are they going to meet their transition pathways, or are they abandoning those pathways altogether and developing new ones? How can energy security be promoted without really damaging commitments, or is it possible to promote energy security without damaging commitments to that countries have made for greenhouse gas emissions and other such processes?
How is Africa today affected by the war in Ukraine if it comes to energy security?
Yes and no. Yes, because we experienced the rise in oil prices as well as the rise in the cost of fertilizer. I think something that a lot of people don't know is that one of the big uses of natural gas is for the production and the creation of fertilizers. And Africa is very much reliant on fertilizers from Russia. Some African countries are reliant on that, and changes to the cost, to the price of natural gas really has a ripple effect on everyone else throughout the system. Additionally, another place in which energy became an issue was across the continent. We saw a rise in food inflation. How does food inflation relate to energy prices? Well, transportation costs um, of food items is included in the price you get at the till. So when the transportation costs increase, the prices must also increase. The cost of cooling and freshness for these products. In many countries, you have people using, say, a generator, diesel generator, to keep your foodstuffs cool and fresh. What's going to happen to them? They're vulnerable to swings and changes in the global price of these commodities. So, yes, we were affected by it in many ways, but at the same time, we were not necessarily affected in the exact same way that Europe was. There are ways in which we're affected very similarly, but ways in which we're very differently affected as well.
No, and I think that's a very important point, though, because yes, in Europe, everybody talks about inflation, and I don't want to talk it down. Things do get more expensive. But in Africa, there are many communities, there are many groups who cannot afford an inflation of, let's say, 2% points or 3% points, where it then really becomes difficult to put food on the table. It's then maybe not just less or different things, but I think that's a very important component you bring up here. And I would be very interested also if we would take the Ukraine out of the equation, let's just say, and talk about energy security within Africa. We talked earlier in our conversation about the grid and how energy is moving around or not. What are your thoughts on that? And how much of a priority is that among nations in the continent, or is it coming back to zones? But if we talk about energy security in Africa, what are your thoughts? What are your hopes or your desires?
I think with regards to energy security on the continent, energy security is at the core of any country's energy policy. I don't think you can have a country that does not pay attention to having access and secure access to affordable, reliable energy resources. I think where the questions come in is in the implementation of these policies in an effective manner. But yes, energy security is central to all African countries and how they approach energy policy. Um, in terms of regions, there is a regional commitment around the African continent to universal energy access on the continent by 2050, but not only 2030, sorry. How and whether we'll be able to meet that, I'm not too sure. But I think having these goals and ambitions in countries moving to support them is really, really critical. I know the African Development Bank has its high fives, one of which is the electrification of Africa. And that is really going to be a big boost to support the ways in which countries can access finance for their electricity grids and their electrification, as well as increasing electricity access. I mean, when you have a continent in which 600 million plus people have no access to energy or access to electricity, it raises questions about what are the developmental outcomes. So, my hope, my dream, my desire is to see the continent increasing energy access for all people, but not just energy access, but modern access to energy. This is your electricity, your petroleum products, and natural gas for the different consumptive needs that people might have. Because something that people don't really consider is that in Africa, A lot of people who have access to energy, or rather, who we might think is energy insecure, have access to biomass, um, which is your burning of your wood, your burning of dung for that, for energy, to meet their energy needs. That's not necessarily safe for people. You have a lot of people who die of carbon monoxide poisoning. And this is not to knock or reduce um, the significant role that wood and these fuels play for people. But in order to move towards greater developments on the continent, the universalization of access to modern energy resources, is going to be critical.
No, and I believe that this is one of the reasons why the work that people like you do is so vastly important. So I want to very much acknowledge you for each and everything that you do in writing, with your studies, with your work, and with so many other projects and initiatives you're involved with. And when you were just talking, it reminded me of something that you said earlier. There are good strategies, there are good plans, and now it's time to put them into practice and to implement them, and also to stay realistic in a way. We're not going to change a whole continent or even just one country overnight, right? It's going to take space, it's going to take time, and we need these genuine interactions in order how to solve or how to approach or how to make use of this opportunity also. So thank you very much for that, Vincent. And I have a couple of questions that I ask each and every of my podcast guests. But before we go there, is there a particular topic or a theme that you think we haven't really discussed in much detail today that you would like to shine light on?
I think it'll also connecting it to the whole question of energy and the future of energy globally, but also in Africa, is the question of critical minerals for the energy transition. Um, you know, I think critical minerals that often end up being that forgotten cousin to energy security conversations at times. Critical minerals such as your copper, your lithium, and others, and cobalt, exist on the continent in significant quantities. However, without a commitment to the sustainable extraction, sustainable usage of them, we're not going to be able to meet the demand. I know that today we have a what some people call a commodity super cycle for copper, in which we're seeing significant high prices in the copper price, due to buoyed by the demand for electric vehicles and renewable energy technologies. One of the first things that I tackled with as I started my career was the question of Zambia and Zambian copper. Looking at Zambia, looking at the debt challenge that Zambia was faced with at the time, but also looking at the huge opportunity that the price of copper presents for Zambia's development. Um, how do we square that circle? Critical mineral policies need to consider not just the needs of the European countries or the other countries, America, your Australia, and anywhere else. We also need to understand the needs of the countries in which you're extracting them from. The Democratic Republic of Congo, which we've spoken about previously, is your biggest supplier and producer of cobalt globally, right? However, the Democratic Republic of Congo is also a place with poor standards for natural resource governance at some level. So, as a natural resource governance researcher, one of the things I need to look at is what are the ways in which we can move the needle on natural resource governance here, but what are the ways in which we can also promote and find ways to get partners to team up and support these countries in how they're approaching pursuing these issues and these matters.
And speaking of critical minerals, and also in particular maybe about Zambia, maybe you have some thoughts on the question when I would ask you, how does a country or how should we as a global society also control supply and demand for such minerals. Meaning, yes, it could, of course, boost a country's economy vastly, I believe. But to which extent should we maybe also consider alternatives or question the consumption that stands behind the massive demand for those minerals that we have?
I think it's going to be a fine balancing act between production and consumption. Something like copper, I think what people don't often think about is copper is infinitely recyclable. Um, a lot of the copper that's already been mined has been recycled multiple times. Um, you never know that if the electric electrification wires in your house there were originally used in some Bronze Age um, instruments or implements, wherever you are. So copper is infinitely recyclable. I think that there needs to be more done for the recycling of these products and these goods. Um, at the same time, production needs to be ramped up to meet the demand, which is an unfortunate reality that we really have to come to grips with. If countries are going to be committed to the green transition, we're going to need to ramp up and increase demand production of these goods to meet the demand for it. However, at the same time, processes need to be put in place to make sure that we do not end up in a lowest um, common denominator situation where we just go down, we sink to the lowest level of regulation or rules around the extraction and of these resources. There needs to be adherence to the rules of the game for extraction, as well as moves away from resource nationalism. Now, resource nationalism is where a country which produces these resources says, we're not going to supply other countries with these resources, it's ours, or we must control everything of this resource. I don't think resource nationalism helps a country in the longest term. Um, I think resource nationalism creates manifestation or really good grounds for the natural resource curse, which is that terrible inverse relationship that we see between wealth of resources, be it timber, be it fossil fuels, be it gold or whatever your resource is, and economic growth and development. We see manifestations of great and significant amounts of corruption. So we need to be able to make sure we balance demand with consumption, but also we prevent and address issues around the resource curse.
No, absolutely. And again, I believe that's another topic we could have another episode on for a couple of hours, not only on minerals, but even in particular about the extraction of such in territory boundaries of countries. And is that a just understanding of how the resources of a planet, of what many people call our commons, can and should look like? Or is that very much not the way? And how do we do that? Do we do that via taxation? Do we do that via exchange? I think there are multiple paths forward. So thank you very much for bringing that up also. I think the topic of minerals, as you nicely stated, is one that is many times forgotten, or at least a little bit neglected if it comes to energy and energy transition. Vincent, with that, thank you very much. And I would like to move to the last final three questions of today's podcast episodes. And I think we already covered quite a bit, and we also found out that we can have many more conversations on particular topics, which is also always beautiful to have a reason to come back. And Vincent, my first question would be, what is it that makes you hopeful?
My family, my mom, my sisters, um, they make me hopeful. They inspire me in so many different ways. Seeing how each of us has grown and evolved and developed over the last 20 years is just amazing to watch and behold. My sister's wedding gave me a moment to just look and pause and think back on the fact that we were all little kids once, arguing and running around with each other, and today um, she's married and witnessing the love, the outpouring of love to her at her wedding, from her friends to all of us, was just a really beautiful thing to behold.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing that. And in fact, family is a common answer for the second question that I'm now going to ask you. And that is, who are your mentors, or whom do you look up personally?
My mentors, well, my family, but also some of my friends' parents, who have become like parents to me, as well as some of my friends themselves. I've been blessed to have a lot of figures, mentors in many ways that I could look up to. One of which is a former professor of mine, Obisie, who, you know, really guided me through a lot of my undergraduates, encouraging me and just reminding me to keep up the good work. Don't forget you're doing good. Don't worry about that. Just keep going. And I've been blessed and fortunate to have a lot of people like that find me at different points in my life. And yeah, I'm hoping and looking forward to the day that I can return the favor to someone and say, "You're doing great, buddy. Keep up the good work. I believe in you."
Wonderful. And I believe you already do so by sharing your expertise and knowledge via such formats as this podcast. So thank you very much for that, Vincent. And the last and final question for today's podcast episode, anyways, is something that I call the three truths. So I would like you to imagine that you are traveling all by yourself in space, and you are traveling for quite some time. And after all that solo travel, you encounter a human-like species, but they can only process three facts or three truths about humanity before they decide whether or not they want to get to know us. What is it that you tell them?
Well, wow. Firstly, I'd say we have a lot of capacity for empathy. Um, I'd say we have a large capacity to make things better, and try and help each other. Um, and I'd say that we sometimes need help in understanding each other better. So while we do have this huge capacity for good and benevolence, we sometimes need help to bring out the better angels of our being.
Wonderful. I very much like that, Vincent. And with that, thank you so much for being a guest on the Just Another Mindset podcast. And if you have any final message to our audience, it's all yours.
Thank you so much for having me, Ismael. I think the work that you do is amazing, and I've been following your podcast since you reached out to have me on. And I just want to say thank you for having me on, but also thank you for the work that you do. And I'm looking forward to seeing this podcast grow from strength to strength.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much. If you enjoy this podcast and learn from it, please feel free to share this episode with a friend or two, and make sure to subscribe to the Just Another Mindset podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please use the next 10 seconds to give the Just Another Mindset podcast a rating, and know that you will help me to create more meaningful content like this, and also that it will help other people to find this content and get inspired as well. If there is any future topic or guest that you would like to hear more about on the Just Another Mindset podcast, please let me know by leaving a comment on YouTube or sending a mail directly to contact@ismaelwondergarten.com. And if nobody told you lately, be reminded that you are worthy, you matter, and you can achieve anything.
Do more of what makes you happy.
Be yourself. Positive.
Change.
Just another mindset.